I never thought shoveling snow would lead to a full-blown war, but that's precisely what happened. It all started with an old, abandoned farmhouse and a woman who had crowned herself queen of our quiet little neighborhood. My name is Jack, and for a decade, I had lived a pretty simple life in a community called Oak Haven Estates. It was the kind of place people moved to for peace, a little bit of land, and a general agreement to leave each other alone. I ran a small landscaping and snow removal business from my home, which meant I had the heavy-duty equipment to handle just about anything Mother Nature could throw at us. My neighbors were my clients, but they were also just neighbors. We'd wave, we'd borrow a cup of sugar, and we'd respect the unwritten code of not being a nuisance. The governing body of our neighborhood was a homeowners association, but for the first 8 years I lived here, it was mostly a formality. It existed on paper to manage the small common area by the entrance and make sure nobody painted their house neon pink. The annual fee was minimal, and the meetings were attended by the same 4 people, who mostly just drank coffee and approved the mowing contract for the front green. It was benign, almost invisible, and that's how everyone liked it. We were a community of practical people, teachers, mechanics, nurses, and a few retirees. We valued common sense over rigid rules. Then, Carol moved in. She and her husband bought the house on the corner, a big 2-story colonial that she seemed to believe gave her some kind of feudal authority. From the moment her moving truck pulled away, she took an intense, almost predatory interest in the HOA. She attended the first meeting after she arrived, then the next, and within 6 months, through a combination of sheer persistence and the general apathy of everyone else, she had been elected president. None of us thought much of it at the time. We figured, who in their right mind would want that job? Let her have it. That was our first mistake. The changes started small. A new font for the neighborhood sign, a freshly painted white line along the edge of the common area's driveway. Then came the emails. The first one was about trash cans. They could no longer be visible from the street except on trash day itself. It was a minor annoyance, but people grumbled and complied. Then it was about lawn maintenance. Grass had to be kept under 4 inches. Holiday decorations had to be removed within 7 days of the holiday. The emails became more frequent, the tone more condescending, quoting bylaws and sections that none of us had ever read or cared about. Carol, it turned out, was a connoisseur of rules. She didn't just enforce them, she savored them. Our once benign HOA was transforming into a petty dictatorship, and Carol was its undisputed tyrant. She would walk the neighborhood with a clipboard and a measuring tape. I once saw her measuring the height of a neighbor's decorative garden gnome. Apparently, it was half an inch too tall. He received a formal warning letter the next day. People were annoyed, but nobody wanted to start a fight. It was easier to just move the gnome or hide the trash cans. We were a community of conflict-averse people, and Carol weaponized our desire for a quiet life against us. Her power grew in the vacuum of our collective shrug. The centerpiece of her ire, the one thing that seemed to offend her on a deep personal level, was the old Miller farmhouse. It sat at the very back of our development, on a sprawling 10-acre lot that was mostly overgrown field and woods. The house itself was a classic, a 2-story clapboard structure from the late 1800s with a wraparound porch and tall, dark windows that looked like vacant eyes. It had been empty for as long as anyone could remember, owned by some distant family trust based out of a law firm in the city. It wasn't part of the bustling neighborhood, but it was a landmark, a piece of local history that we all felt a strange affection for. To us, it was a beautiful, melancholic reminder of the area's rural past. To Carol, it was an unacceptable eyesore, a blight on her perfectly curated suburban utopia. The winter that changed everything was a bad one. A nor'easter blew in and buried us under 2.5 feet of dense, heavy snow. It was the kind of storm that shuts everything down for days. The municipal plows were overwhelmed, focusing only on the main arteries. Our little network of residential streets was completely impassable. For me, a storm like this was an opportunity. It was work, yes, but it was also a chance to be genuinely useful. I fired up my big Ford F350 with the commercial-grade plow on the front and got to work. I spent the first day clearing my existing clients' driveways. But as the snow kept falling, it became less about business and more about necessity. The mail carrier couldn't get through. People were running low on supplies. Mr. Henderson in the blue ranch house needed to get to a dialysis appointment. I just started plowing. I cleared our main loop, Oak Haven Drive, then started on the side streets. Neighbors came out with thermoses of hot coffee and waved their thanks. It felt good. It was the kind of thing you do in a community. You help. My last pass was down the long, dead-end street at the back of the neighborhood, Chestnut Lane. At the very end of it was the private gravel drive that led back to the old Miller farmhouse. On a whim, I decided to clear it too. The lane was choked with snow, and I figured if there was any kind of emergency back there, a fire, a burst pipe, first responders would need access. It took me a good 45 minutes to push back the heavy drifts, but when I was done, there was a clear path from the main road all the way to the house's crumbling front porch. I didn't think twice about it. It just seemed like the right thing to do. The next morning, as I was sitting in my kitchen nursing a cup of coffee and enjoying the quiet beauty of the snow-covered world, there was a furious pounding on my front door. It wasn't a friendly knock. It was the kind of hammering that says someone is angry. I opened the door to find Carol standing on my porch, her face pinched and red with fury. She was wearing a pristine pink parka and holding her ever-present clipboard, which now had a light dusting of snow on it. "Jack," she said, her voice tight and devoid of any pleasantry. "We need to talk." She didn't wait for an invitation, but pushed past me into the entryway, stamping her boots on my mat. "Good morning, Carol," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Everything okay?" "No, everything is not okay," she snapped. "I was just doing my morning inspection of the neighborhood, and I noticed you used your commercial plow on the access road to Lot 1. Lot 1 was the official designation for the Miller farmhouse property. I was taken aback. "You mean the old farmhouse?" "Yeah, I cleared the lane. Figured it was a good idea for emergency access." Her eyes narrowed. "As per the Oak Haven Estates Homeowners Association bylaws, Section 12, Paragraph 4, Subsection B, commercial equipment is not to be used for any activity not directly sanctioned by the board. Furthermore, Section 15, Paragraph 2 clearly states that HOA funds and community efforts are to be restricted to member properties only. Lot 1 is not a member in good standing." I stared at her, trying to process the sheer absurdity of it. "Carol, it was a blizzard. I was just clearing a path. It didn't cost the HOA a dime. I did it on my own time, with my own truck and my own fuel." "That is irrelevant," she said, her voice rising. "You performed an unsanctioned service on a delinquent property. You are setting a precedent. What's next? Are you going to start mowing its lawn? Painting its shutters? This is a clear violation of protocol." My initial disbelief was quickly hardening into annoyance. "A delinquent property? It's abandoned, Carol. Who exactly is supposed to be paying these dues you're talking about?" "The owner of record is a trust," she said dismissively, as if this explained everything. "And they have been derelict in their community obligations for years. The property is an eyesore, and we are not in the business of rewarding their negligence with free services." This was where my logic and her dogma crashed head-on. I wasn't rewarding anyone. I was preventing a potential fire truck from getting stuck in a snowdrift. It's called being a good neighbor. "You are not a neighbor to that property," she declared, her voice dripping with condescension. "You are a member of this association, and you will abide by its rules. This serves as your official verbal warning. The next violation will result in a formal written citation and a $500 fine. Do you understand?" She stared at me, her expression one of utter, unshakable self-righteousness. I felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp. This woman was standing in my house after I had spent a full day helping our entire community and was threatening me for an act of basic civic decency. But I knew arguing with her was like reasoning with a brick wall. I took a deep breath. "I understand what you're saying, Carol," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Loud and clear." She gave a curt nod, her lips pressed into a thin, satisfied line. "Good. See that it doesn't happen again." With that, she turned and marched out of my house, leaving a trail of melting snow and righteous indignation in her wake. I closed the door behind her and leaned against it, my head spinning. The war had begun. A week later, a crisp white envelope appeared in my mailbox. It bore the official Oak Haven Estates HOA logo, which Carol had recently redesigned to include a crown over the oak tree. Inside was a formal letter, typed and signed by Carol herself. It cited the date of our conversation and documented my violation. It then informed me that I had been fined $500 for unauthorized use of commercial equipment on non-member property. She had backdated the fine to the day of the storm, completely ignoring her own statement that the next violation would trigger the fine. She had jumped straight to punishment. I was furious. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was the principle of the thing. I had done something good for the community, and this petty tyrant was punishing me for it. I tried calling her. The call went straight to a voicemail that announced I had reached the office of the HOA president. I left a message, trying to sound as calm as possible, stating that there had been a mistake and that she had explicitly told me the fine would be for the next violation. I received no call back. Instead, 2 days later, I got an email with the subject line, "Second notice, unpaid fine." The email stated that if the fine was not paid within 30 days, a late fee of $50 per day would be applied. This was when I realized she wasn't just being a stickler for the rules. This was personal. I had challenged her, however mildly, and she was going to make an example of me. I started to see her tactics for what they were, a campaign of intimidation designed to ensure absolute compliance. My anger began to cool and was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She had picked the wrong guy to bully. My business was built on contracts, permits, and regulations. I knew how to read the fine print. The conflict began to affect more than just me. A few weeks after my fine, I was talking to Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow who lived a few houses down. She was a sweet woman who had lived in Oak Haven for 40 years. She was distraught. Carol had sent her a warning because the paint on her mailbox post was flaking. The letter stated she had 30 days to repaint it to the community standard color or face a $100 fine. Mrs. Gable lived on a fixed income, and her arthritis was so bad she could barely hold a coffee cup, let alone a paintbrush. "I don't know what to do, Jack," she told me, her voice trembling. "I can't afford to hire a painter for something so small, and I certainly can't do it myself." That was it for me. This wasn't just about me and my plow anymore. Carol was actively harming vulnerable members of our community. That afternoon, I went over to Mrs. Gable's house with a can of the community standard black paint and a brush. It took me all of 20 minutes to repaint her mailbox post. She tried to pay me, but I refused to take a dime. As I was finishing up, Carol's car drove by, slowing down as it passed the house. I looked up and met her glare through the windshield. I gave her a polite, friendly wave. Her expression soured and she sped off. I knew I had just painted a bigger target on my own back, but I didn't care. The next fine arrived a week later. $250 for performing unauthorized maintenance on another member's property. The letter claimed that all external work had to be done by licensed and insured contractors approved by the board. I owned a licensed and insured contracting business, but I obviously wasn't on her pre-approved list. The absurdity was breathtaking. I was being fined for helping an elderly neighbor for free. The fines were now totaling $750, plus the accumulating late fees she was tacking on. I knew I couldn't fight this on her terms. Arguing with her was pointless. I needed a different kind of weapon. I needed information. I called the lawyer I had used a few times for my business contracts, a sharp, no-nonsense guy named Mr. Miller, no relation to the farmhouse. I explained the whole situation, from the snowstorm to the mailbox post. He listened patiently, letting out a low whistle when I got to the part about the fines. "Well, Jack," he said when I had finished, "you've stepped into the hornet's nest. HOAs can be notoriously difficult. The law often gives them broad powers, and the courts are reluctant to interfere in their internal governance unless there's clear evidence of fraud or discrimination. So I just have to pay this woman nearly $1,000 for plowing a road and painting a post?" I asked, frustration creeping into my voice. "Not necessarily," Mr. Miller said. "Her power comes from the association's governing documents, the bylaws and the covenants. But that power is only legitimate if the association itself is operating legitimately. Her enforcement has to be consistent, and the rules she's enforcing have to be legally sound. You said she mentioned the old farmhouse property was delinquent. Yeah, that's the word she used, I confirmed. That's an interesting choice of words, he mused. It implies they're supposed to be paying dues and aren't. If you want to fight this, you need to stop fighting her and start fighting the paperwork. You have the right as a homeowner to inspect the association's financial records. I'd start there. Look for the money. If there's something strange about her authority, the money trail will show it. That conversation was the turning point. It shifted my entire perspective. I was no longer just a frustrated homeowner. I was an investigator. My new mission was to find out everything I could about Carol's kingdom and the foundation it was built on. The next day, I sent a formal certified letter to the HOA, addressed to the board, not just to Carol, requesting a complete copy of the financial records for the past 5 years, as was my right under state law. 2 weeks went by with no response. I sent a follow-up letter, this time referencing the specific state statute that mandated their compliance. The day after that, I received a thick manila envelope on my doorstep. It contained hundreds of pages of financial statements, budgets, and meeting minutes. Carol had complied, but it was malicious compliance. The documents were a disorganized mess, seemingly printed in a random order, a classic bureaucratic tactic designed to overwhelm and discourage. It wasn't going to work on me. I spent the next week of evenings at my dining room table, a highlighter in one hand and a legal pad in the other, piecing together the financial puzzle of Oakhaven Estates. Most of it was boring but predictable. Income from dues, expenses for landscaping the common area, insurance, a small slush fund for repairs. But then I found it. Tucked away in the income ledger was a recurring line item that caught my eye. It was a quarterly payment of $1,250, listed as dues, Lot 1. Lot 1, the Miller Farmhouse. According to Carol, the property was delinquent. But according to her own financial records, someone was paying dues on it. And they weren't just paying, they were paying a significant amount. $5,000 a year, far more than the $600 the rest of us paid. I cross-referenced this with the expense reports. There were no expenses associated with Lot 1. No maintenance, no services, nothing. For years, the HOA had been collecting $5,000 annually for a property it did nothing for. This was more than just strange, it felt wrong. Why would a trust that owned an abandoned property be paying exorbitant HOA dues? And if they were paying, why did Carol claim they were delinquent? Was she lying to me to justify her anger about the plowing? Or was something else going on? My investigation was no longer just about my fines. It was about a $5,000 a year mystery. The next step was to find out who actually owned the farmhouse and who was running this trust. My lawyer, Mr. Miller, had told me to follow the paperwork, and the next piece of paper I needed was the property deed. I drove down to the county clerk's office, a dusty old building filled with the scent of aging paper and quiet bureaucracy. I gave the clerk the address for the Miller farmhouse. After a few minutes of tapping on her keyboard, she pointed me toward a massive book of property records from the year our development was built. I spent an hour poring over deeds and plat maps, and then I found the original master plat for the Oakhaven Estates development. It was a huge, detailed drawing showing every lot, every road, every common area. I found my own lot, then Mrs. Gable's, and then I found Lot 1. It was there, at the back of the development, a huge 10-acre parcel. But there was something different about it. While all the other lots that made up Oakhaven were shaded and enclosed within a thick, solid border labeled Oakhaven Estates Phase 1, the Miller farmhouse property was outside that border. It had a dotted line around it, and in neat, clear letters next to it was the word excluded. I felt a jolt, a sudden flash of understanding. I pulled the founding charter for the Oakhaven HOA, which was filed with the county. It explicitly listed every single lot number that was incorporated into the association. Lot 1 was not on the list. It had never been part of the Oakhaven Estates HOA. It was, and always had been, a completely separate, independent piece of property. My heart was pounding. The HOA had absolutely no jurisdiction over the Miller farmhouse. None. They had no right to levy dues, no right to set rules for it, and no authority to fine me for doing anything on it. For years, they had been collecting dues on a property they had no legal connection to. I went back to the clerk and asked for the ownership records for Lot 1. The owner was listed as the Miller Family Heritage Trust, and the contact address was for a law firm in the city. Everything clicked into place. The original developer had built the neighborhood around the old farmhouse, but had intentionally and legally excluded it from the HOA. The Miller family, who had sold the surrounding land, wanted to keep their ancestral home separate. The trust, managed by a busy law firm, had probably been receiving an invoice from the Oak Haven HOA every quarter for the past 12 years. Assuming it was a legitimate local tax or fee, some clerk in their accounting department had just been paying it without question. It was $5,000 a year, a rounding error for a large trust. They had no idea they were being scammed. Carol hadn't been lying when she said the property was delinquent. She was just completely and utterly wrong. She had inherited this system from the previous sleepy HOA board, who had probably been sending the invoices for years out of sheer habit or ignorance. But Carol hadn't been ignorant. She had weaponized the supposed delinquency of the farmhouse. She used it as a symbol of defiance against her rule and as a justification to punish me. And all along, her entire premise was built on a foundation of sand. She was collecting money under false pretenses. That wasn't just mismanagement. As my lawyer would later tell me, it was dangerously close to wire fraud. I had it. This was the leverage. This was the bomb that would not only clear my name, but would blow her entire reign of terror sky high. I made copies of everything: the plat map, the HOA charter, the deed for Lot 1. I walked out of the county clerk's office not as a defendant, but as a prosecutor. My strategy had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer defending myself against her ridiculous fines. I was preparing to dismantle her entire power structure. I spent the next few days preparing my case. I organized the documents into a clear, chronological narrative. I created a simple presentation on my laptop, with scans of the key documents in highlighted sections. I wasn't just going to tell people what I had found. I was going to show them. I also took one more step. I contacted the law firm that managed the Miller Family Heritage Trust. I got a junior associate on the phone, explained who I was, and calmly laid out my findings. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, the associate said, "Can you hold, please? I need to get Mr. Albright on the line." Mr. Albright was a senior partner. I explained the story again. He was furious, but not at me. He was furious that his firm had been paying bogus invoices for over a decade. He thanked me profusely and told me they would be launching their own investigation and would take all necessary legal actions to recover the misappropriated funds. He also gave me a crucial piece of information. The trust was, in fact, preparing to sell the property. The final piece of my plan was the venue. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for the following month. It was usually a sparsely attended affair, but I knew this one would be different. Carol had alienated so many people with her petty tyranny that discontent was simmering just below the surface. I started talking to my neighbors. I didn't reveal my trump card, but I told them I had discovered some serious issues with the HOA's management and finances. I spoke to George, a retiree who had lived here longer than anyone and despised what Carol had done to the neighborhood. He became my ally, helping me spread the word. We urged everyone to come to the meeting. We told them it was time to take our community back. The night of the meeting, the community center's drab, multi-purpose room was packed. I had never seen more than 10 people at one of these meetings before. Tonight, there were at least 60. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. Carol and her two board cronies, a timid man named Barry and a woman who mirrored Carol's every opinion, sat at a folding table at the front of the room. Carol looked smug, pleased with the high turnout, likely assuming it was a testament to her strong leadership. She started the meeting by rattling through her agenda, proposing a new set of even more restrictive rules. A new regulation on the exact shade of white for window trim, a ban on basketball hoops being left out overnight. People were shifting in their seats, murmuring. Finally, she reached the open forum portion of the meeting. "Does anyone have any new business to discuss?" she asked, a thin, challenging smile on her face. I stood up. "I do," I said, my voice calm and steady. Every head in the room turned toward me. Carol's smile vanished. "Jack, I assume this is about your outstanding fines. This is not the forum for that. You need to follow the appeals process as outlined in the bylaws." "Actually, Carol, it's not about my fines," I said, walking toward the front of the room. I had brought a small projector and my laptop. "It's about the HOA's finances. It's about Lot 1. A ripple of interest went through the crowd. I set up the projector and aimed it at the blank wall behind her. "For the past few months," I began, "our HOA president has been pursuing a campaign of fines and harassment against me and other members of this community. Her justification has often centered on the idea that we must maintain standards and that all properties must be in compliance. She has repeatedly referred to the old Miller farmhouse, Lot 1, as a delinquent property that is a blight on our neighborhood." I clicked to the first slide, a scan of the income ledger showing the $5,000 annual payment from the trust. "This is a page from our own financial records. As you can see, the HOA has been collecting $5,000 a year in dues for Lot 1. So the property is not, and has not been, delinquent. In fact, it pays more than 8 times what any of us do." Carol's face was turning pale. "That is confidential financial information," she sputtered. "It's our information, Carol," George called out from the crowd. "We pay the dues, let him speak." A chorus of agreement followed. I continued, my voice gaining strength. "So I asked myself, why are they paying so much? And what are we, the HOA, doing for that money? The answer is nothing. But the more important question I found myself asking was, why are they paying us at all?" I clicked to the next slide, the county plat map. I used a laser pointer to trace the thick border around Oak Haven Estates. Then I pointed to the farmhouse property, sitting clearly outside the line. "This is the original plat map for our development, filed with the county. As you can see, the Miller farmhouse was legally and intentionally excluded from the Oak Haven HOA. It has never, not for one single day, been a part of our association." A collective gasp went through the room. People were leaning forward, staring at the map, then at Carol. Her face had gone from pale to a blotchy, furious red. "This is a forgery," she shrieked. "This is a lie." "It's a public record, Carol," I said calmly, clicking to the next slide, which showed the HOA charter with its list of included lots. "And so is this, the HOA's own founding charter. I invite everyone to look for Lot 1 on this list. You won't find it." I then put up the deed for the farmhouse, showing its independent status. The evidence was irrefutable, laid out for everyone to see. "For 12 years, I said, my voice ringing through the silent room, this homeowners association has been sending invoices to the Miller Family Heritage Trust. For 12 years, you have been collecting dues you are not entitled to. That's $60,000, collected under what appears to be false pretenses. And you, Carol, have used the fictional status of this property to justify your harassment of the people in this room." The room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting questions at Carol. "Is this true? Have you been lying to us?" Carol was completely unraveling. "This is an illegal proceeding. I am the president. You are all in violation of the bylaws," she screamed, her voice cracking. Her 2 board members looked horrified, slowly pushing their chairs away from her as if she were radioactive. I wasn't finished. I held up my hand for quiet. "There's one more thing," I said. The room fell silent again. "This morning, I spoke with a senior partner at the law firm that manages the trust. They were unaware of this situation, and they are displeased. They have launched a formal investigation and will be seeking full restitution of all funds paid to the HOA. That's $60,000 that this association will have to pay back. Money that, according to the budgets you approved, we don't have." That was the final blow. The financial reality of the situation crashed down on everyone. Her petty tyranny was one thing, but bankrupting the association was another. In the back of the room, someone was on the phone. I heard the words fraud, and "We need an officer here." Carol, seeing her authority completely shattered, seeing the faces of her neighbors turned against her in universal contempt, grabbed her clipboard and purse and stormed toward the exit. "I will not be subjected to this insubordination," she yelled, shoving her way through the crowd. "This meeting is adjourned." Nobody listened. As she fled the room, George stood up and took her place at the front. "I think the first order of business," he said into the sudden calm, "is a vote of no confidence in our president and the current board." The motion was seconded by a dozen voices at once. The vote was unanimous. Just as the vote concluded, two uniformed police officers walked into the room. The house of cards Carol had so meticulously built had just come crashing down. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The police took statements from me, George, and several other homeowners that night. The district attorney's office opened a case file the next day. The investigation revealed that while the practice of billing the trust had started before Carol's tenure, she had been made aware of the questionable legal standing of Lot 1 by the previous treasurer a year prior. An old email, recovered from the HOA's laptop, proved she knew the property was likely not part of the association, but chose to continue the billing and use its delinquent status for her own purposes. That elevated it from a mistake to intentional fraud. Carol was formally charged with multiple counts of wire fraud and theft by deception. The legal process dragged on for months, but the evidence was overwhelming. The plat maps, the charter, the bank statements, and the damning email sealed her fate. She was found guilty. Her sentence included a hefty fine, a period of probation, and, most importantly, an order of full financial restitution to the Miller Family Heritage Trust. To pay it, she and her husband had to take out a second mortgage on their big colonial house. The symbol of her supposed status became the monument to her downfall. All the fines and legal threats against me and my neighbors were immediately dropped. The HOA was placed into a temporary receivership by the state while we sorted everything out. The first thing the interim board did was nullify every fine Carol had issued during her reign. My $750, plus the ludicrous late fees, vanished as if they had never existed. My name was cleared, but the feeling was more than just vindication. It was a profound sense of communal relief, like a fever had broken. With Carol gone and the old board dissolved, we had a chance to start over. George, the wise elder who had backed me up, was elected as the new interim president. We held a special meeting, not in the stuffy community center, but as a barbecue in the common area. We rewrote the bylaws, stripping out all of Carol's draconian additions. We kept it simple: be safe, don't be a nuisance, and be a good neighbor. The annual dues were kept low, just enough to cover the absolute necessities. The HOA returned to what it was always meant to be: a quiet background facilitator of a peaceful community, not its warden. A few months after Carol's conviction, I got a call from Mr. Albright, the lawyer for the Miller Trust. They had successfully recovered their $60,000 from Carol's personal assets. He thanked me again for bringing the matter to light. Then he said something that made my heart skip a beat. "You know, Jack, the trust has decided it's finally time to sell the old place. Given your history with it, we thought it was only fair to give you the first opportunity to make an offer before we list it publicly." 2 months after that phone call, I was standing on the wraparound porch of the Miller farmhouse, holding the keys in my hand. I had bought it. The house that had inadvertently started this whole war was now my home. It was a wreck, of course. It needed a new roof, new windows, and a forest of overgrown landscaping cleared away. But it was solid, with good bones, and a history I now felt inextricably linked to. It was the ultimate symbol of my victory, a 10-acre slice of peace and quiet that no HOA could ever touch. It's been a few years now. The farmhouse is restored. I spent every spare moment of my time bringing it back to life, and the work settled something in me. The wraparound porch is my favorite spot, where I can sit and look out over my fields and the peaceful neighborhood beyond. Oak Haven Estates is better than it ever was. The community spirit that awakened during the fight against Carol never went away. We have neighborhood block parties now. People talk to each other. We look out for one another. Not because a rule tells us to, but because we want to. Mrs. Gable passed away peacefully last year, but in her final years, she never had to worry about her mailbox paint again. Her lawn was always mowed, and her driveway was always plowed, tended to by a rotating cast of helpful neighbors. I saw Carol one last time, about a year after she and her husband sold their house and moved away. I was in a grocery store in a town about 30 miles away. I almost didn't recognize her. She looked smaller, diminished. The self-righteous fire in her eyes was gone, replaced by a weary, defeated look. She saw me, and for a moment, I saw a flash of panic in her face. She started to turn her cart away, but then she stopped. She walked over to me, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Jack," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." It was a pathetic, mumbled apology, devoid of any real understanding of the harm she had caused. It was the apology of someone sorry they got caught, not sorry for what they did. I didn't feel anger, though. I just felt a kind of detached pity. She was a small person who had been given a small amount of power, and it had consumed her. "I hope you're doing okay, Carol," I said, and I meant it. I didn't need her apology. My vindication wasn't in her admission of guilt, but in the quiet life I was now living. She just nodded and hurried away, a ghost from a past I had already put behind me. Sometimes I think about the whole absurd affair. It started with a snowstorm and ended with a complete restructuring of our community. It's a lesson, I suppose, in the dangers of petty tyranny. It shows how easily a desire for order can curdle into a lust for control, and how good, quiet people can be cowed into submission by a bully with a clipboard and a rule book. But it's also a story about the strength of community. When pushed too far, when the line is crossed from minor annoyance to genuine harm, people will stand up. The fight to take back our neighborhood taught me that reason and truth are powerful weapons, especially against those whose authority is built on lies and intimidation. It taught me that sometimes you have to be willing to start a war to protect the peace. Now, when the snow falls, I still fire up my plow. I clear my driveway, then my neighbor's, and then I make a pass down the long gravel lane that leads to my own front door. And every single time, I smile. It's a quiet act of defiance, a reminder of the battle won, and a celebration of the simple, unassailable freedom of being a good neighbor.